Good afternoon, everybody. Apologies for disrupting your lunch, but we're going to kick the program off. I'm John Walsh, Chairman of the Board of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia and CEO of UGI Corporation. It's my pleasure to be here, and I certainly welcome you all to the interesting program we have for you today. Before we begin, take a moment to silence your cell phones and any other electronic devices. Having said that, we certainly encourage you to tweet about what you hear this afternoon. The World Affairs Council is also on a number of other social media platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, all of which you can access from the World Affairs Council website. So we certainly encourage you to check out our website. There's a lot of work going into the website to make it more user-friendly and provide more value and information on the website, so we encourage you to be there. I'd also like to remind everyone that we have an event scheduled for May 19th with Timothy Geithner, former Secretary of the Treasury, and any of you who are interested in attending can register either on the website or by calling the World Affairs Council offices. So hope to see many of you there on the 19th. We'd certainly like to thank St. Joe's University, the Hobbs School of Business, and in particular, our own distinguished board member, Joe D'Angelo, Dean of the Hobbs School, and the Dean's Leadership Program for their partnership in today's event. We were delighted to be able to collaborate with St. Joe's on today's program. Now, I'd like to welcome Dr. Michael McCann, Associate Dean of Natural Sciences, Mathematics, and Computer Science, to the stage to introduce today's topic and speaker. Dr. McCann.
Thank you, John. Just a few words about St. Joseph's and then about the program today. At St. Joseph's, I have the privilege of serving as the chair of our Sustainability Committee. I think it's very appropriate to be here today for this, and thank you for letting me be part of the program. At St. Joseph's, we've taken to heart the growing recognition that sustainability, understood as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs, is a fundamental aspect of Catholic social doctrine. As theologian Dr. Brian Benestad stated, every subject Catholic social doctrine treats pertains in some way to understanding the requirements of a sustainable community. This concern for the common good is also an explicit element of our institutional mission. With this in mind, we provide opportunities for all members of the SJU community to contribute to our mission, thus serving the university, the church, and ultimately the common good. It is precisely because we are Catholic and Jesuit that we are dedicated to making sustainability an integral aspect of our operations, community relations, and educational endeavors. And that's why I'm so happy to be here today. So now on to today's topic. As some of you may know, fracking, or hydraulic fracturing, is the process of injecting fluid into the ground at extremely high pressure in order to fracture shale rocks and release the oil and natural gas inside. It has been the subject of 3 major films, countless news articles, and has become a hotly contested topic, both for its environmental impact and its effects on the economy and job creation. In particular, right here in Pennsylvania, fracking has been the subject of much debate in the state's Marcellus Shale region, giving Pennsylvanians and residents of the area a specific interest in its effects. This afternoon we have Russell Gold, award-winning Wall Street Journal senior energy reporter and Pulitzer Prize finalist, joining us to discuss fracking. At the Journal, he is responsible for covering all facets of global energy with a particular focus on the U.S. energy boom and the use of hydraulic fracturing. He will offer his insights into the energy industry and will discuss the fascinating history of how this major news source is changing the way we use energy. Gold's recently published book, The Boom: How Fracking Ignited the American Energy Revolution and Changed the World, examines both sides of the argument and illuminates aspects of this frequently misunderstood technology. We're looking forward to an insightful exploration of what may well be today's most controversial, yet promising, new energy technology, fracking. Please join me now in welcoming Russell Gold.
There have been relatively few writers and journalists who have been allowed to observe a frack job and write about it. Sometimes you'll get a tour, but usually There's not actually fracking going on. And I wanted, as part of the book, to actually spend a night while the well was being fracked. And it took a long time to get permission to do this. So fortunately, thankfully, Marathon Oil, which is a Houston company with an annual profit larger than the GDP of some countries, not kidding about that, basically said, look, too much secrecy has hurt the industry. And he said, yes, we will let you spend some time. So I ended up near Killdeer, North Dakota, to absorb the fracking of the Irene Kovaloff 1118H. Well, on sort of the southern edge of what's called the Bakken Shale. Talk about shales. A shale is a rock. Marcellus Shale, Bakken Shale. In Texas, we have the Eagle Ford. A lot of controversy about the Monterey Shale out in California, the Utica Shale. Shale, it's a very dense sedimentary rock. This is where oil and gas begins its life. Yeah. Dead protozoa, plankton, and drop down. Eventually they get covered over by mud and rocks, and a few millennia later they get cooked with pressure and temperature into fossil fuel, oil, gas, hydrocarbons. And so when we talk about the Marcellus Shale, we're talking about a thick slab of rock that has an enormous amount of gas in it. Sometimes, depending on the temperature, it turns out it's more oily, sometimes it's gassier. The Marcellus is very gassy. The Bakken is very oily. So there was nothing particularly unusual or exotic about the Irene Kovaloff. It was one of about 100 wells that was drilled and fracked in the United States that day, 10 in North Dakota alone. But it was a great place to witness this, because this was the North Dakota then and now sort of shows us the unvarnished rush of this energy boom. Trucks crowded the road everywhere you went. I stayed in Dickinson, North Dakota, where about a week before the city engineer had quit, citing workload stress, which is, you can kind of understand that. There were 5,000 new residents had moved into the city in 2 years, making 1 out of every 4 Dickinsonians a new arrival. There were 5 job openings for every job applicant. Local Walmart and McDonald's could not staff them. A few years ago, North Dakota produced 100,000 barrels. It's almost at 1 million. It was just, I think it was 977,000 barrels a day. So to put that in perspective, that's larger than 2 members of OPEC, Ecuador and Libya. 1 state, North Dakota, is now currently larger. And a few years ago, 2005, it was relatively nothing. So what did it look like? I got there after the well had been drilled. First, you bring out a big drilling rig. This is what looks like that sort of mini Eiffel Tower. You drill down, usually, depending on how deep, a couple miles, then you turn it, and you run horizontally, sometimes for a mile, sometimes for 2 miles. Disassemble the rig, move it to the next place, then you bring out the frack equipment. That's a lot of water. Depending on where you are, 2 million, 5 million, 7 million gallons of water. So think about 40, 50, 60 trucks, the back part of trucks, the trailers, filled with water, lined up, creating a wall around 2 sides of this flattened pad. There were chemical trucks, sand trucks, 400,000 pounds of sand. There were mixers. There were pipes everywhere. One of the first things they told me when I got on the site, they put a hard hat on you and they say, watch where you're walking. There are pipes everywhere, you're going to fall, you're going to hurt yourself. They were right. I didn't fall, but I get close. And right in the middle is the well, which at this point is sort of about a 10 or 15 foot tall series of valves, red. And my the company man, as he's called, the person in charge, the foreman, said, was explained to me, he said, inside each of these are these small little brass gaskets and little pinholes, and all the pinholes have to be lined up facing north. And I said, well, why north? Is there something about the Earth's magnetic across? He says, no, it's just oil field superstition. If they're facing south, you might as well just walk off. And, I actually thought about this, and I talked to some other people, and they explained that this isn't as silly as it sounds. Because this is incredibly dangerous. The pressures are incredible that they deal with. And if you can count on the people to arrange the brass gaskets in just the right way, then they're paying attention to what they're doing. And you're probably not going to get hurt. It's like the old thing, if you ever heard about the rock band that comes and says, we want a bowl of M&Ms, but no red or green M&Ms. Well, it's not that they don't want red or green M&Ms, but if you can count on the people who set up your stage, where you could get hurt, to make sure that you're taking all the red and green M&Ms, your attention to detail, you probably count on going out on stage and not being hit by falling light. It's the same principle at stake with the gaskets facing north. And so inside there was the heart of the operation was the data van. This is where everything was run, all the computers. And the data van, the best way to describe it is, think about like a NASA command center with all these engineers sitting there with their crew cuts and starched shirts, except instead of, they're all sitting in front of their computers. Well, the same guy sitting in front of the computers, but everyone had this big, long, flowing hair and mustaches and goatees because there really weren't that many places to get your hair cut in North Dakota. They're growing too quickly. So NASA meets NASCAR. And they're executing this to a T. 30 fracks on that one well. It took them about 24 hours to do. And everything had to be done just so, very, very coordinated. And it was really a fascinating experience. The people were, what they were doing was taking an enormous amount of water mixed with sand and chemicals to create, in North Dakota, they create something that almost looks like the child's toy slime, if you remember that from the 70s, which it actually is very similar to, because slime is water with guar. Guar is a bean that's grown in India, and that's used quite a bit in fracking, so it looks like it for a reason. You put some chemicals in, a lot of them actually, to kill off any living organisms, to reduce friction, because you're pumping in. So think about if you swim a couple of feet down in a pool and your ears start feeling a little pressure, just from a couple feet of water above you. So then imagine sitting on the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico with 12,000 feet of water above you. And the pressure there is not equal to the pressure that they're pumping the frac fluid in. They're actually creating more pressure. Water basically doesn't compress. You put that much pressure up against the water, something gives, and what gives is the rock. And it will create just a network of fractures all of a sudden, equal to a single frac, if you're doing it right, will be equal to about the floor space of 10 giant balls of America, king of pressure balls, if you're here. Just an enormous amount of cracks. And that's critical because that's where the oil and gas will come out of the rock into those cracks and flow into the well. So that's really what the game is about. Creating cracks in the rock, creating pathways for the oil and gas to get out. Why do we frack? Let's think about that for a second. We don't frack because the industry likes to get into it as environmentalists. We frack because easy oil is over. The old days of spindle top where you drill a well and there's so much pressure and that reservoir is coming up and you're dancing underneath it. That's gone. Those have been found by and large. I'm not sure there are none left in the United States. There may be a couple left around the world. What the industry does typically these days is go to further and further extremes and spend more and more money to get oil and gas around the world. Kashagan in Kazakhstan is this incredible complex project that's cost $50 billion so far. And they just had to postpone it another 2 years because they're dealing with a corrosive gas and they've got to replace the pipeline. $50 billion has been spent over the last 10 years. They haven't gotten anything out of it. There is a giant natural gas deposit off the coast of Australia called Gorgon Wheatstone. One of the engineers who discovered it in the 70s retired. They still haven't gotten gas out of that. These are the big projects that the industry is going after. So then all of a sudden, someone figures out a way, like, wait a second, the United States, which we thought was out of oil and gas, has tons of oil and gas left. You just have to frack it to get it. The industry says, well, yeah, we know how to do it. We've got a high success rate. 99% of these wells will produce oil and gas. Let's go. But that's only one side of the picture. That's the supply side. There's also the demand side. The globe uses about 90 million barrels a day of oil, about 1/5 of that in the United States alone. We use much more per capita than any other major industrialized country. There essentially is, look, there is a very clear correlation between your economic prosperity, the cars you drive, the computers you use, and the amount of energy you use. And so on the demand side, we frack because there's a huge demand for fossil fuels right now. But, so I say, okay, so oil and gasoline and natural gas also has become the birthright of modern industrialized economies. But that doesn't mean it always has to be this way. Because one thing you need to realize about what's going on right now with fracking and with renewables also is that we are having an incredible upheaval. Once in a generation, maybe even once in a two-generation change in our energy system. Coal, which used to be dominant, is getting replaced right and left. We're actually having a debate about what we're going to use to drive our trucks and our trains. Are we going to use gas? Are we going to use diesel? And then on the backdrop of all this, we have climate change. And we have the growing amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is driving a lot of this change. So, oh, and then let's add to that energy independence, something that since Nixon's era, we have been pursuing. Nixon promised to get us a Project Independence. He was going to get us off, here it is, 1973, Richard Nixon announced Project Independence. He was going to eliminate dependence on fossil fuel energy by 1980. By the end of the decade, imports had doubled and gotten off energy. Every president since then promised to reduce our dependency on foreign oil, and everyone failed, up until the current president, the current administration. We are importing a lot less oil. It used to be about 60 to 70% of the oil, now we're down to 30%. We thought we were going to become gas importers, because we were running out of gas. We're now looking to become a massive gas exporter. This has been a sea change in energy production. And you know, in the last couple weeks, last 3-4 weeks, my books come out, I've been crisscrossing the country, talking to groups, lots of radio and TV interviews, and people keep wanting to ask the same question, which is a really important question. Is it safe? And they want a yes or no answer. Is it dangerous? Yes or no? And I'm afraid to tell you there really are no easy answers here. There are unforeseen costs and necessary evils that we're facing. I mean, it's like saying, is medicine safe? Well, yeah, some medicines are safe and some new medicines aren't safe. Is nuclear power safe? Well, we've had a good track record, except for 3 Mile Island and Fukushima and Chernobyl. But we want this simple solution to what's an incredibly complex problem. And it's really one of the signal problems, if not the most important problem that we're facing right now. How do we produce the energy that we as a world need and demand and want safely without destroying the environment? How do we produce enough so it's affordable so that people can use it? And how do we do it in a way that doesn't destroy the environment, doesn't put too many greenhouse gases into the atmosphere? And so I'm not going to give you, I mean, I'm more than happy in the Q&A we can talk about specifics, earthquakes, water, air emissions. I've got lots of answers, but the jury's still out. Fracking grew so fast. Back in 2003, there was none of this. It was very, very little. A couple wells north of Fort Worth. Now it's everywhere and it's spreading internationally. The oldest modern well we have, modern frack well, was in 1998. So one of the questions is, well, these wells, when they're fracked, they're going to give us 30 years of oil and gas. Well, yeah, maybe, but we actually don't have the data to back that up. We've got one data point that's 16 years old at this point. So we push for the energy boom, and it's been incredibly successful in many ways, the technological changes. But a lot of the key questions, we're just now getting around to answer. How much methane gas is leaking? What's the impact on communities? Are there areas that should be off limits to fracking for whatever reason? These are questions we're only answering now. And to get back to the is it safe, is it not safe, I think there are very good reasons to frack. Creating all this energy, especially natural gas, is creating a lot of flexibility for the energy system. It's allowing us to bring a lot of renewables onto the system. Renewables are expensive, but yet our electricity prices are going down. So we haven't rejected that. Like in Germany, which has brought in lots of renewables, they're having sticker shock right now because the price has gone up so much. Not in the United States, because we have natural gas, cheap natural gas. And natural gas is wonderful, it's balancing. When you bring in more renewable energy, how do you balance that? Because it's not dispatchable. You can't tell when to turn on and off. Sometimes the wind's not blowing. Natural gas is a wonderful way to balance that. So there are lots of positives, but then there are lots of negatives. And I guess my takeaway message really is that there just needs to be a lot of vigilance here. We're never going to come up with a perfect balance of energy and environment. We're going to find the right balance for right now, and then next year, with more information, we're going to need to stay vigilant, maybe adjust it a little bit. But this energy boom is an incredible opportunity for the country to make changes, to envision a future, to ask the question finally. You can't really ask the question, where do we want to be? What kind of energy do we want to have when you're in an energy scarcity and you're just grabbing as much of it as you can from wherever you can find? That's no longer the case. We can relax for a second and say, we have lots of energy in this country. Now we need to figure out what we use it for. Do we shut down all the coal plants, clean up our air, reduce carbon emissions, replace them with gas plants? Do we take all the trucks on the road and run them on natural gas? Do we create lots of jobs making petrochemicals along the Gulf Coast? There's lots of possibilities here. First time in a long time we've had these possibilities. And that's the conversation that needs to happen right now. And it is happening. And, you know, this is, I mentioned right at the top that I grew up in Philadelphia, and my parents owned some land in north central Pennsylvania, right in the heart of the Marcellus. And a few years back, Chesapeake Energy came to them and said, do you want to sign a lease? And it was a really tough question for them. And they went around to all the their neighbors, and they talked to all the farmers in the area. Because they own this land as a place to go away, vacation, sort of cheap weekends out of the city. And all the farmers had signed. So they knew whatever the choice they made, they were going to be surrounded by pipelines and rigs. But there's a great story from the 70s when they were building, because they built the house there. They owned it with a bunch of friends. They all got together to build the house, and none of them really knew what they were doing. I mean, let's face it, they weren't carpenters or plumbers. My dad did the electricity, which is kind of scary. And the inspector came out and took a look at the electrical work and said, I'm not signing off on this. And so he starts to walk away, and my father thought, you know, this was 73, 74, the Rizzo era, and things were a little, bribes kind of happen in Philadelphia to make things. So my dad thought, well, the guy wants a bribe. So he kind of goes after him, he's sort of trying to figure out if that's what's going on. And the inspector turned to him and said, you see those kids over there? I mentioned these two little mop-headed, curly-headed kids. I was one of them. If anything were to happen to them, I could never forgive myself. And he walked away. Because money is important, but getting stuff right is important also. We are tearing down the energy infrastructure and rebuilding it in this country right now. And it's really important to get it right. Because if we don't, in a generation, we're going to look back and really kick ourselves. Because this is an opportunity. And they don't come along all that often. Thank you very much. I can stay if people can see and hear me.
Let me make sure this is on first. Can you hear me now? So we're going to open up the question and answer session. I see questions already, so I don't have to worry about starting with the question.
Hi, one of the concerns I have is what will happen to all these cracks? I mean, could the surface sink because of these cracks?
They are very, very deep. Fracking takes place 2 or 3 miles deep. I have not heard of any sinkholes related to fracking. There has been concern that maybe the cracks will allow some of the water and the chemicals to go up into the aquifers. That's also not really what's going on there. There are a couple instances where that took place in Wyoming, but these were incredibly shallow wells. The typical well, that's not the case. Now, however, so fracking itself, I'm not worried about fracking itself causing cracks. But before you can frack that well, you got to drill down and over. That is the critical component. Because if you're not building a well correctly, if you're not making sure that the cement around the outside sets properly, then you just created a nice big superhighway for whatever is deep down to get up. So I think more needs to be done on what's called well integrity. I think that's really, really important. So I have not read about, trust me, I read all the articles and the scientific, the peer-reviewed. Ground sinking, settling, that's not something that worries me. What building the wells right does concern me. I think the industry is doing a decent job of it and could do better.
Can you tell me what are in the chemicals that they inject? Did they tell you that?
Typically, you have biocides and friction reducers. Frackfocus.org is a registry by each well, and a lot of states now require producers, drillers, to report all this to frackfocus.org, so you can go there and look up by county the exact well and find out what's in it. There are some very, the percentages are tiny, but when you're talking about 5 million gallons of water, even 0.5% means several hundred gallons. These are industrial chemicals. You do not want to ingest them. You do not want your kids playing in them. They're not safe. They need to be managed just like any industrial, like any industry, like any factory. That's why it's incredibly important to require things like duck ponds. A duck pond is kind of a heavy-duty plastic where you park your trucks and whatnot, so if there's a spill, it collects in the duck pond. That's why it's incredibly important when you're bringing the water back up after the frack, because you inject the water and then most of it, well, not most of it, a lot of it comes back up, that you don't just let it vent out, because all sorts of the BTEX chemicals, toluene, ethylene, xylene, carcinogens can come out. You need to capture all that. The tricky part for the industry has been, if you tell it to build a factory, it can contain all these chemicals quite well and build all the safety. You're building a factory in 2 weeks, tearing it down and building it again. And that's been the tricky part, and that's why it's difficult, and that's why you hear of spills and whatnot. There absolutely needs to be, and I don't think there's any question anymore, a very vigilant regulatory regime to make sure this is done right. Most companies, I think, do it right, protect their workers, protect the environment, but I think last time I checked, 200 different companies, 300 different companies drilled a well in Pennsylvania last year. It's a lot of companies to keep an eye on. I hope that answers. But look at frackfocus.org, they give a list, and the problem is that even once you do that, it's sometimes difficult to figure out what all these chemicals are.
Before we get off that topic.
Yes.
Since we're talking about chemicals in the environment and regulatory processes, can you elaborate a little bit more on exactly who has the overarching responsibility in regards to, first of all, the approval of these chemicals that end up being part of the fracking process, and what type of requirements are associated with those in terms of legislation or regulatory overview? So it's really, in fact,
it's a state issue by and large. There are federal rules and oversights about material safety data sheets and reporting and handling. But by and large, it comes down to the State Department of Environmental Protection here in Pennsylvania, and the Railroad Commission in Texas, and there has been a movement towards greater disclosure and greater oversight. California has come out with new rules on this recently. We are clearly moving in that direction. The industry has fought back in the past, and one of the big controversies over fracking was the exemption under the Clean Water Act for fracking activities. So for a long time, industry didn't have to disclose exactly what was in there. And I think that frightened a lot of people for very good reason, because you're talking about bringing chemicals all over the place, injecting into the ground, and shouldn't we know what chemicals there were? But is there a comprehensive regulatory body which is keeping an eye on this? No. It's more piecemeal than that.
Isn't the methane, a real danger to the environment?
Yes.
And there isn't proper regulation over that at all. And why not? Is it just a money interest?
All right, a bunch of great questions. So let me try to explain, so you know, just make sure everyone understands what you're asking about. Methane is natural gas. When we talk about natural gas, something like 90% is methane. When you take natural gas and take it to a power plant and burn it to generate electricity, you release a lot less carbon dioxide than you would if you get the same amount of electricity from coal. So people say, natural gas is a much superior fuel than coal from a climate perspective, and it is, except if you're leaking methane, because methane is a really potent greenhouse gas. And if you're leaking it out, whether it's at the wellhead or in the pipes or along the route, and too much of that goes up in the air, you might as well burn coal. So that's become a really big question. How much methane is leaking out? The EPA says one thing, and there were studies here. There's been a lot of different and conflicting studies on that. So can I give you a straight answer? Yeah, but in 2 weeks it changes because then we'll have another study coming out. The most comprehensive studies I've seen say as follows. Fracking from a life cycle, from the beginning to the end, is better in terms of releasing greenhouse gases than coal. And it can get even better than that, because a lot of the leakage that goes on is really basic plumbing problems, leaking valves, leaking gaskets. And so it's better already and can get substantially better. Colorado and Ohio just passed rules which say you need to go out and you need to be on site and you need to be monitoring for methane leakage. And if you see it, you need to fix the problem. That's basically what the Colorado rules said. We have yet to know whether this regulatory approach will work and how it will do, but it's being addressed. And then the federal government, at the beginning of next year, has a rule that's also required this kind of green completion, prevent the leakage, for oil wells. No, it's for gas wells, excuse me. They need to change it, in my opinion, to cover all wells. Because there really is no such thing as an oil or a gas well anymore. All the wells have a little bit of both. Why not? It's a good question. Because the studies also show that if you're capturing all that methane and selling it, you can actually pay for the equipment to capture it. So why isn't this done more often? Because the industry was moving really, really quickly for the last few years. Once shales were discovered, there was a rush to lease the land. Companies were incredibly competitive. I mentioned Aubrey McClendon, he led that rush. And once you lease the land, you have a certain amount of years until you have to drill on it. So they wanted to lease and drill really quickly. It was a rush. It was, the treadmill was turned up to 10, was the expression. And to slow down and make sure your suppliers had enough of this green completion capturing technology just wasn't in the cards. It wasn't financially there. Things have quieted and slowed down. The land rush is over. Things are being developed now in a more orderly way. And that's why I think states are feeling a little more comfortable being able to say, thou must have technology to capture it. I wrote an article 2 or 3 weeks ago with 3 ways to make fracking safer. That was number 1. Capture more methane. Deal with that problem.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions for you. I used to work for the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. When these companies drill, who has the mineral rights?
It depends. Sometimes it's the service owner, sometimes it's been split, separated. So sometimes you'll have the service owner and the owner will be different people.
Well, the problem is that if a homeowner gives up the mineral rights, that means a drilling company, they can screw up your water supply, do anything they want,
Yep.
and a homeowner can't do anything about it. That's dangerous, that's dangerous territory.
I agree. I write about the, my book is not so much a policy book, it's a book of stories about people and the history, and I write about Otis Grimes, who in 1919 lived in Burke Burnett, Texas, and bought a plot of land for his family to live on, but didn't own the mineral rights. The company came and set up a derrick right next to his house. He brought a lawsuit, and it was essentially the court sided and said, we're sorry, mineral rights are dominant. So I agree with you that this is a problem, but we have decades of legal cases and government saying mineral rights are more important than surface rights. They are the dominant estate. And, you know, look, just yesterday, 2 days ago, there was a $3 million lawsuit settled in Texas because a family didn't own the mineral rights. They came in, they caused all sorts of nuisances, and they eventually sued. So I don't disagree with you.
All right, then the other part of my question is, when you have millions of gallons of water injected into the environment, how's it treated? It has to come out someplace.
The water that's injected down a well, most of it stays down there. The water that's brought back, Pennsylvania first tried to send it to water treatment plants. That was not a smart idea because the water treatment plants weren't up for it. Now they put it into trucks, basically truck it west to Ohio because there are very few injection wells in Pennsylvania, and they inject it deep underground to get rid of it. It is not a great solution. Some of it's being recycled through using additional fracks, but it's been an issue because there's just a lot of water that's being used, and water that comes back needs to be significantly treated. I think a lot more can be done on recycling and cleaning up the water.
A little bit of a different angle here.
Sure.
Geopolitical.
Yes.
If everybody starts fracking, then the Middle East and its oil starts to take on a different geopolitical perspective.
Yeah.
How do you see, I see.
I already think that's going on. So let's talk about oil for a second. I mentioned that the United States got 70% of its oil imported just a few years ago. Now it's down to 30 or 40%. When we import so much less oil, and basically I think the United States, North America, Canada, US, and Mexico, could essentially become self-sufficient in oil, over the next few years. When you use so much less oil, you have more flexibility in where you're getting it from. You're no longer so dependent on any one region that you need militarily and politically to make sure that those spigots stay open. Our Fifth Fleet has been patrolling the Middle East and the west coast of Africa for a long time to make sure the oil keeps flowing because it was deemed a matter of national importance. But when you're using that much less, and you can all of a sudden say, you know, it's sort of a classic situation. You go from the sellers being controlled to the buyers being controlled. And so the balance of power is shifting. So are we energy independent? No. And we probably shouldn't be. There's no real point disconnecting from the rest of the world. But we are independent in the sense that we're becoming that much less dependent on any one nation. And I think that's a good thing. Because with energy dependence comes all sorts of sacrifices, and we're getting more flexibility. So I think that's one of the benefits right now of the energy bill. Yes.
Both your story about your dad as the electrical contractor,
Yes.
and your story about Aubrey McClendon, who was pushed out of Chesapeake for
Yes.
financial improprieties.
He was.
And but money found him again to go drill again in Ohio.
Yes. You know your business.
Okay, so both of those are good stories about the need for more regulation.
Mm-hmm.
Pennsylvania, for example, you were talking about the chemicals. By state law, you're not allowed to know what the chemicals are in the... And the law goes to the extent that if a doctor suspects that somebody has been poisoned by the chemicals...
They can't find out.
The doctor can find out what the chemicals are so he can treat the patient, but the patient cannot know what chemicals affected him. So that's by Pennsylvania state law. I think, though, some of the things you're talking about really speak to the need for greater regulations. And to have a discussion about it, not I'm for jobs, I'm for the environment, but more, let's talk about fracking as a bridge and as a natural gas to get away from coal, use natural gas and oil as bridge fuels to get to renewables. But how can we have that conversation? Because one side screams jobs, the other side screams environment, and we're not getting to the discussion.
I agree.
Without smart legislators.
I'm with you.
Okay.
Do you want to? Yes.
Without smart legislators talking about these issues, we're not getting there.
No, I agree. The more I look at this and think about this, the more I think regulation is critically important. I think that the gag rules that you see in Pennsylvania, I can't understand it. And the other thing I will say is, because I talk to a lot of CEOs, I don't think they really get it either. You know, the CEOs of the oil and gas companies could be your allies, because it's the service companies, the Halliburton, Schlumbergers, and Baker Hughes that are actually using chemicals. So I think this is one of those things where it just becomes so calcified, but there's absolutely, the only reason to hide what chemicals you're using is because you think you can get a proprietary advantage, and that's, I've talked to a lot of people who say that the trade secret argument is just ridiculous, and that there should be absolute disclosure, especially if 100 wells a day are being drilled and fracked in the United States. That's a large number. It's 1,000 every couple of weeks. I mean, there needs to be more responsibility, and adequate disclosure of chemicals, I think, is absolutely critical. But look what happened in West Virginia a few weeks ago with the chemicals. This won't, one of the things I point out is that if we're not getting the oil and gas from here in the United States, we're just going to be importing it from somewhere else. And there's going to be even less environmental protections. I mean, I've been to Nigeria, I've been to various places, of course, reporting. It's not a pretty picture. I think we can actually do it right here. And if we're going to use the energy, let's figure out a way to do it in a more sensible manner. And so you kind of touched on a hot button issue here, and I can get a little passionate about it, which is great. But you've asked a really important question. Well, how do you get this conversation going? And I actually think it's happening already. Politically, in Colorado and in Pennsylvania, you've got two gubernatorial elections that Colorado absolutely, and Pennsylvania possibly, will really turn on this issue of fracking and energy. So I think people are getting the message enough to realize that, hey, this is really important. It's become part of the political process, and hopefully that will result in something good. In my book, I write a lot about people like a woman out in Hoopany, Pennsylvania, some other folks in Bartonville, Texas, communities that have decided we're not going to put our head in the ground and say no fracking, we want to bring it in, we're going to try to regulate it, and they're very involved, they're asking lots of questions, they're kind of coming up with a lot of good regulatory fixes, whether it's sound walls around the drill pads so you don't stay up all night, whether it's baseline testing the water, so that before you frack, you drill and figure out exactly what's in that water, so if there's a change, you absolutely know it. There are some really smart regulatory fixes, and I think the more people get involved, then the more, maybe I'm naive and optimistic, but I do think, I'm seeing a lot of very positive movement on this. It's not quick enough for a lot of people, but certainly moving in that direction.
Thank you.
You talked about a shale providing about 30 years worth of oil and gas, but we don't really know that, right? Is there any conversation about what happens in 30 years, what that looks like when you're...
No, but there should be.
Right? And so your family's land,
Yeah.
I mean, when they come in and you're dangling a cash in their face, are they telling them some sort of risk? Are they saying, here's what the risks may be, and this is what might be happen when we part ways in 30 years and leave you with land you now own that could maybe, be detrimental?
No, that conversation, and not just my family, but many places, there are no requirements for disclosure of exactly the risks. Now, I find a lot of, when you get out to Pennsylvania, you're talking to farmers, they're pretty savvy about their land and their water. I've got one great story about these farmers who ended up getting into a lawsuit with Chesapeake over this. Because they're not, this is their livelihood. This is generational. But you raise a really important question, really interesting question, which is, okay, we've got 30 or 40 years, however much it is. We don't exactly know. It's not 100 years. But in terms of this, lots of oil and gas. And the more, frankly, gas we have, the more things we'll use it for, and then we'll go away. This is the opportunity. Because if we squander it, and in a generation, in 20 or 30 years, we're looking back and say, God, we really did make that transition over to renewables, then we're in real trouble. And this is a real opportunity to do it, because we have inexpensive electricity, we can afford to do it, we have the nimbleness and efficiency of natural gas to back this up. We really can, this is why I say we can look back with relief or regret on this energy boom. It's our choice. I know what I would like, but I only get to write the book.
So,
reason for not having regulation is generally not having the money to afford the regulators, or the additional engineers that are overtaxed, because thousands of people are moving to areas. So what is going on nationally with, we're hearing about taxation a lot, and should we tax, how much should we tax? And
Pennsylvania doesn't have like or it doesn't actually have
that's
a
the
permit fee, but doesn't
gubernatorial,
have a tax,
right,
yeah.
right. So what's going on nationally with?
Everyone else does. No, it's serious. I don't quite understand, and I need to look a little more into why Pennsylvania didn't. I mean, Texas does, everyone else does. Everyone else sees this as a big chunk of their state revenue. You know, there are a lot of costs associated, all sorts of costs, financial and otherwise, associated with this. And I forget the rule, what's it, the permit fee money, I think it said it was going to generate $200 and some million this year, next year.
225 million.
225 million, and
Last year.
40% was going to go to deep. I mean, they have different. I think that makes perfect sense. Good regulators are hard to come by. I mean, I encountered this when I covered the Deepwater Horizon, and the offshore regulators was like, man, you got a good regulator, and they were hired away by the industry like that. You know, and that's. I don't have a very good solution. There is one thing that the state can do, which I think is actually a fairly simple fix, which starts to help. Most states, and the federal government used to do this, will have a certain function to encourage oil and gas development because it generates money and jobs and it's economic growth, and that's great. The cheerleaders function. And quite often they'll have the regulators under the same roof. And the same agency will be charged with promoting and raising revenue and also regulating and making sure it's done right. I've never seen an example where that's done well under the same roof. You just take them separate. After the Deepwater Horizon spill, Macondo spill, the federal government did that. And I think that's very sensible. Although in Pennsylvania, North Dakota, and all the major shale states, it's still under one roof. And I just think if you want to begin to have faith in a strong regulator, you need to make it independent, well-funded, and not also charged with promotion of oil and gas development. I don't think it can work out.
We're down under 10 minutes, so we'll take a couple of questions.
Okay. And I'll speak quickly.
First, thanks for your presentation, but very interesting and balanced, and I appreciate that. I'm an educator, so my question is about education.
Okay.
If we wanted to bring awareness of fracking to our students as part of a course, besides your book, what resources and websites would you recommend for students to understand the history and pros and cons of fracking?
Penn State's Marcellus Center, the Shale Center, is quite good. I can give you a card because I know some people over there. Statoil, the Norwegian oil and gas company, and Marathon also have done, I think, fairly even-handed have websites to show exactly what's involved in it, which are fairly even-handed. Environmental Defense Fund on the environmental side, I think, has done a very good job in the National Resource Defense Council. So I would look at those resources, but definitely start with the Penn State's Marcellus Center for Shale Outreach. I'll get you the name. Let's do Penn State.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for a great presentation as well. A comment and then a question.
Sure.
When we were talking about mineral rights before,
Yes.
maybe I'm putting a legal hat on a little bit, but I'm wondering the possibility of people that are giving up their mineral rights at least having something in the written agreement that they would be indemnified if there were problems that resulted from that. Now, whether the other sides would agree with that, I don't know.
Yeah.
That went through my head.
That's a big issue. I mean, even in Florida, where there has been no shale development that I know of, there's a Sunnyland Shale. There are developers now that are developing subdivisions and keeping the mineral rights. And the number of people across the country you talk to and say, well, do you have your mineral rights in the house? No one knows. It's something you don't think about. And one of the things about the shale boom, the energy boom, is that this is not taking place in Alaska or the Gulf of Mexico. This is taking place in large swaths of the country. And it's a big deal. The courts have been moving towards giving the surface owners more rights, but essentially the way you put on the legal hat, the courts have decided that the mineral rights are the dominant of the state. The surface is the servant. And that just comes from the fact that the courts and the government have wanted to encourage oil and gas development and coal before that.
And then another question is, you mentioned that there doesn't sound like the federal government is that much involved in this at this point. Would it be helpful, I've been doing a lot of seminars lately about how great presidents have had a great strategy and they articulate it, and so forth. Would it be a good idea to get the federal government more involved? Or would it
The federal government has been focusing its environmental muscle on power plant emission rules, which are very important also. They have not been particularly involved, and to the extent they've been involved in fracking, both President Obama and Secretary Ernie Moniz, formerly of MIT, the Energy Secretary, have been, their approach has been essentially pro-fracking, regulated but pro-fracking. So I think, as with anything else, the federal government has a role to play in terms of setting minimal regulatory requirements. Perfect example are the earthquake issue, the disposal wells. Permitting of disposal wells is a federal function. Sometimes the states get primacy and can take over. You know, why not require that you need to determine whether there's an active earthquake fault anywhere nearby before you start pumping all sorts of water in? And that's something the federal government can do. So I think the federal government could pick its fights, but right now, it's focusing its muscle on the downstream side, on the power plant side, which is very, very important for actually, I think that they're doing a very, very good job, very interesting. The other place the federal government's been very involved in is fuel efficiency standards, which are also an incredible, I mean, it's a success story that people don't even begin to talk about. Gasoline usage in the United States is down. When was the last time you really heard or thought about that? So, yes, ma'am.
This is the last one.
All right.
I'll be quick. Thanks for a great presentation. I'm a physician, and I'm based in Philadelphia, but many of my colleagues in Pittsburgh and Western, it's a major issue, and I'm actually an emergency physician. So what we do actually is we grade the state in how well we provide emergency care to the state of Pennsylvania. We just ask you, knowing what happens in other states in the country, how would you grade Pennsylvania's A, B, C, D, E, F as dealing with the issue of fracking?
Solid C. I think it botched Act 13, which was the local control issue. I think not putting some sort of tax on it to fund other programs is just a giveaway. Yeah, I'll put it that. I think Colorado is way out ahead. If you want to ask me which state's really engaged and doing a good job, I would say look at Colorado. California is lots of regulations, but they don't really have that much experience. Colorado's doing it. They know they're getting a lot of stuff right now. And what's interesting is that the governor might be tossed out because of it. People are just not, they just don't, there is not a big groundswell for the let's do it right. People don't want to do it. So.
On that note, I'm sorry we have to end now. I want to thank Russell Gold. Please round of applause.